I'm sure the roguelike genre needs no introduction, unless you are some whimsical woodland creature living deep in the forest, in which case, how are you watching this video? But to the rest of you, you're probably all too familiar with it. It spans the full spectrum of the gaming space, from award-winning Game of the Year nominees to the niche indie hits, with roguelike elements scattered far and wide throughout the gaming ecosystem. And for good reason. At its core, it's a very fun gameplay mechanic, and is easy to implement. The idea of having everything you worked for on the line, and the chance you could lose it all with your next choice, is exhilarating. And can be rage-inducing, but I think it feeds into the drive to keep playing, and to overcome whatever put an end to your run. But while this is all well and good, recently I've come to find that the genre, as a whole, has become more of a mechanic than a genre, and is very watered down from what it used to be. Yeah, that's right, we're getting pretentious with this one. Now, I want to clear up some terminology first, as it's important to distinguish the different types of rogue-style games. The two biggest ones that are thrown around like a goddamn Gmod ragdoll are roguelike and roguelite. Yes, there is a difference, and given the age demographic of my audience, you probably know about it. But for the sake of the video, I'll explain briefly the features of each. And by the way, I'm no exception to using these terms incorrectly. I, like most people, do it all the time. Roguelite is a genre that covers the widest range of games, with it really only meaning, in a mechanical sense, that you go back to level 1 once you die. A lot of roguelite games have some sort of meta progression, e.g. some unlockable mechanic that helps you, or is necessary, to progress through the game. Usually this is a roster of unlockable characters. However, there are another group of factors that distinguishes lights from likes, those being pretty much the core features of a true roguelike. A roguelike game is one that in one way or another plays like the original game Rogue, with the key mechanics being permadeath, random level generation, exploration, turn-based and grid-based gameplay, hack and slash, i.e. lots of enemies, and resource management in the form of a character inventory. If a game lacks one or more of these features, then it is a roguelite. Which would be nice and simple had the two terms not been mashed together repeatedly until what's left is a slurry comprised solely of a watered-down permadeath mechanic and the complete loss of all the other things that make up a game like Rogue. It doesn't help that nowadays, both of the terms are used to describe the exact same thing. On Steam, most games that should fall into the category of roguelite are usually given the tag of roguelike, action roguelike, or some variation of it, with the actual term that should be used nowhere to be seen. It's kind of common practice now to lump the two terms together when talking about such games, even though it's not accurate. Which I can understand. Roguelike as a genre is pretty old. I mean, Rogue the game released in 1980, and slowly, over the years, as gaming grew as a form of entertainment, and the popularity of such games grew, so did the drive to make them appeal to a wide audience. I mean, try getting the average person to sit down and play something that looks like you slapped the keyboard a few times and called it a game. But I can't help but notice, especially recently as I'm writing this, that along with the meaning of the term roguelike, a great deal from the genre has been lost. Another term that's used nowadays to distinguish the old from the new is traditional roguelike, and is the specific type of game I'll be focusing on in this video. It has somewhat replaced what roguelike used to mean, given the overuse of that term and the fact that it's now used alongside roguelite. It refers to a game that, well, aligns with the tradition of the 1980 release of Rogue. Now, before I dive into that, I want to say that there isn't anything inherently bad about the way modern roguelites are. They are in fact some of my favourite games, despite the abundance of the generic action roguelikes that have sprung up in recent years with the rise of games like Hades. But since I started exploring the traditional scene, I'm starting to lean more towards the old rather than the new, and have had a hell of a fun time doing so. Now, I had heard of a few traditional roguelikes before I started to actually play them, the biggest one, and possibly the most popular one today, being Caves of Qud. Shout out to my favourite merchant guild leader for showing me that one. But I didn't start with this. I actually haven't played it, but I probably will now that I know what I'm in for. I actually started with a funny little game called Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. It was shown to me by a member of my Discord server, and I will be honest, at first I was hesitant to play it, despite it revealing a core memory of the game from about 10 years ago. But I eventually tried it, and got completely overwhelmed and let it gather dust for a week or so. before I said screw it and dived in headfirst with my very limited knowledge. And holy moly, this game slaps. This game, the thing that looks like a glorified Excel spreadsheet, and this is the graphical version too, is the sole reason I'm making this video, and is why I think so much from the genre, nowadays, is not even considered when making roguelikes. Sure, the core idea is mostly there, albeit watered down in most cases, but what I found after playing Dungeon Crawl was that this genre was, and should be, so much more complex. The required knowledge to even begin playing a Dungeon Crawl is enough to put most people off. I was no exception to this, and not to mention the learning curve once you actually start adventuring. You will die a lot. You will be checking the help menu a lot, and while you do, it will feel very slow and repetitive. But if you stick with it, and build up your knowledge, eventually, you will start to get some good runs. And getting a good run in this game is nothing compared to modern roguelites. There is a moment in this game when you find a really good piece of loot, which does not happen a lot, whether it be a weapon, or armor, or whatever. Or even better, when you get yourself into a position yourself, without being handed a rare item, that makes you realize you now have so much more freedom to explore and experiment due to your newfound power. Now, this will go one of two ways. You will either die because you got too cocky, or you'll start to snowball, becoming stronger and stronger, all the while discovering new levels and branches of the dungeon. Until, again, you eventually die of your own hubris. But even if you don't beat the game, getting far in itself feels like such an accomplishment. This is aided by the fact that there is a personal leaderboard, showing the very best and the very worst of your adventures. This sense of great achievement is, more often than not, nowhere to be seen in modern titles. Sure, the little hit of dopamine you get when you reach a new level or unlock a new character is nice and all, but it's nothing compared to the feeling of getting far in a very difficult game, purely from your own knowledge, skill and problem solving, without anything like permanent upgrades or a new character holding your hand. I went into Dungeon Crawl after only playing the in-game tutorials, and following a guide on how to pretty much play the game on easy mode, with a certain race background combo. But everything else I was experiencing pretty much blind, and if I really needed to, or was just curious, I would do my own research on the game's wiki. And while it was quite tricky to get into, in the long run, it made my first exposure to the game much more enjoyable. This isn't to say starting out by learning as much as you can will detract from your enjoyment of the game. And I think this goes for all games. Going in blind just adds a little more excitement, until you die to an enemy that you were supposed to be much more powerful in order to beat. Fuck you, Royal Jelly. Another thing I enjoyed from the traditional roguelikes I played was the RPG element that you don't necessarily get with a lot of modern titles. Usually you're playing as some preset character, with their name, stats, strengths and weaknesses already laid out. But what's usually the case with older games in the genre, or just more traditional adjacent ones, is some sort of character creation. Now, sure, normally you're picking from a pool of species and classes. It's not quite as in-depth as an actual role-playing game's character creation, but still, it's nice to go through and get far with something you laid out for yourself, rather than settling with whichever pre-made character is most in line with how you want to play. I am aware though that Rogue itself lacks any pre-game character creation. I mean, you literally play as the 1980s equivalent of the smiling emoji, but even still, this almost blank slate of a player character allows you to, with a little bit of imagination, project whatever you wish to be into the game. Now, as is theme on this channel, this video wouldn't fit in if I didn't shine some light on some new and lesser known titles within the genre. With it being what it is today, traditional roguelikes are pretty scarce, outside of the big two, those being the previously mentioned Caves of Cud and Path of Acra, and the classics that in my opinion are Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup and Rogue itself. So here's a couple that I think need more attention, and if you're new to traditional roguelikes, provide a good starting point to get into them. First up is one that is very new. So new in fact, it's not even on Steam yet. That being Alchemist Alcove. Now, the dev could not have graced me with the presence of this game at a more perfect time, as they requested I check it out as I was writing this video. Nevertheless, as I'm still exploring the genre, it immediately piqued my interest. I would describe this game as a combination of your average trad roguelike with permadeath, as well as a sort of merging crafting mechanic similar to Little Alchemy, if you know that game. Your goal is to find the Philosopher's Stone, hidden somewhere within the caverns, with you being guided only by your compass. You start with some basic tools, some flint and a knife for attacking and processing materials, and a pair of gloves to grab things from afar. You won't get very far with just these though, and you'll need to experiment by combining the remnants of your enemies to make new materials and magical spells. Said spells have very limited uses however, and the magical items that don't run out only take up more of your limited inventory space. So you'll need to strike a balance of having enough offensive items, food for healing, and a reserve of materials if need be. Now, the game is in its early stages, and it does lack some quality of life features, mainly the fact there's no way to move other than clicking. And it only has a public playtest available on itch, but there are plans for a Steam release, and the dev would definitely appreciate some more feedback, and maybe a cheeky donation to help with the Steam fee. Although the game is completely free to play, and I found was very enjoyable, and it even works in your browser. All the links will be below. Another lesser known roguelike that I had sitting on my wish list for quite some time is The Dungeon Awaits. It is a little less flashy than Alchemist's Alcove, but I have to recommend it due to the fact it has difficulty sliders, and is quite accessible because of this. Although it is a traditional roguelike, so even on the easiest settings it was still quite challenging. It also has an impressive 100 levels, that do get quite elaborate as you delve deeper, and plenty of enemies and items. The combat is also fairly interesting, in that each weapon has a unique shape on the grid, and you can only hit enemies when they enter said shape. Each enemy also has a unique shape in which they can hit you, but this is not known until you inspect one and memorize it. It looks relatively simple on the surface, and is compared to the more complex roguelikes I've played, but it does provide a decent challenge, and I would say it has quite a bit of depth with its wide array of stats, but it is easier to get into than something like Dungeon Crawl. Now, some honourable mentions. I found a first-person rogue while researching for this video, and while it's technically not a true roguelike, because it's 3D, does seem to have all the mechanics of such, and seems like a good entry point if you're used to more modern games, although I can't say much as I didn't end up buying it. Of course, I have to mention Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup again. It may not be the best way to get into the genre, but if you have some patience, it gets so goddamn good. Once I got into it, I only played it and one other game for like 3 days. Mostly Dungeon Crawl though. And if you're feeling up for it, I say give the OG Rogue a try. I mean, it is literally keyboard characters on a black screen, but isn't half bad, all things considered. Of course though, it is quite difficult. With that, I have 2 things to say. If you're a fan of modern roguelikes and haven't tried any traditional ones, I highly recommend that you do, as personally, it's been some of the most fun I've had in gaming in a while. Mostly in Dungeon Crawl, if you couldn't tell already. That game is like crack. And I think we should have more games like it. Sure, we have CUD and Acra, but that's only 2 games. I'd love to see more roguelikes that focus on complexity, world building and difficulty, rather than visuals, and the same formula that has become pretty stale in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, there are some modern ones that really shine through, but they do still lack the charm and the sense of accomplishment that is present in the more traditional roguelikes. But what do you think? Are the roguelike and roguelite genres fine as they are? Or do you think there should be more traditional roguelikes? I hope you enjoyed this slightly different video to what I usually do. And if you're new to the channel and want to see more lesser known, weird, or obscure games, I have a series going for exactly that. With that, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.